There are weekends in motorsports that you just can't shake. You watch the race, you close the app or turn off the TV, and you go to bed. But the images keep coming back. The replays run on a loop in your head, and you think about the what-ifs, the timing, and the consequences. Sometimes those weekends aren't even the most dramatic ones on paper. Sometimes it's just one incident, one moment, one decision made in a fraction of a second that flips the entire storyline of a season. This past weekend at Martinsville Speedway was one of those weekends, but here's what makes this particular moment even more interesting. It didn't happen in isolation. It happened right before a rare pause in the Cup Series calendar, a pause caused by something that has very little to do with horsepower, tire compounds, or pit strategy. We're talking about Easter Sunday. And the fact that these two things are happening at the same time, a significant on-track controversy and a scheduled break from Cup racing, creates this unusual combination of urgency and stillness that fans don't often experience. So, today we are going to dig into both stories, break down what happened at Martinsville, what it means for the driver involved, what some of the most respected voices in the sport had to say about it, and then talk about why the Cup Series goes quiet on Easter weekend, what's still happening in NASCAR this week, and what to expect when the action picks back up. To understand what happened, you have to understand Martinsville Speedway. This is one of the oldest and most unique tracks on the entire NASCAR schedule, a paperclip-shaped, half-mile short track that has been part of this sport since 1947. There are no long straightaways, no room to breathe, the corners are incredibly tight, the banking is minimal, and cars are stacked on each other for almost the entire race. Passing requires patience and precision, and in the final laps of any race at Martinsville, the tension is almost unbearable because drivers know that one wrong move, or one move they perceive as wrong from someone else, can ignite something fast. That's the environment, and now let's talk about what actually went down. Bubba Wallace, driving the number 23 Toyota for 23XI Racing, had been running a competitive race and came into Martinsville sitting third in the Cup Series points standings. A strong position, a sign of consistent performance through the early part of the season. On lap 324, deep into the event, a restart situation brought everything to a boiling point. Carson Hocevar, driving the number 77 Chevrolet, made an aggressive three-wide move into turn 1 during that restart, pushing inside on Wallace and creating contact that put both drivers in a tight, uncomfortable situation. Anyone who follows short-track racing knows that three-wide into a tight corner is one of the most debated moves in the sport. Some drivers respect it as bold and competitive. Others see it as reckless and disrespectful. And where you fall on that debate often depends on whether you're the one making the move or the one on the receiving end of it. For Wallace, it was clearly the latter. A few laps later, the response came. On lap 324, heading into turn 3, Wallace moved up the track and made contact with Hocevar's car, once going in and then again through the middle of the corner. That second hit is the one that mattered most because it sent Hocevar's car spinning, and in short track racing, when one car loses control on the front stretch during a race with a packed field, the result is almost always catastrophic for the surrounding group. That's exactly what happened. Multiple cars got caught up in the wreck. Drivers who had nothing to do with the tension between Wallace and Hocevar suddenly found their afternoons and their points destroyed. And it was the kind of wreck that changes the story of a race instantly. Right away, it was going to be categorized as one of two things: a racing incident or a deliberate act of retaliation. The reaction from fans, analysts, and former competitors was immediate, and it was not quiet. There are voices in NASCAR that carry more historical weight than others, and Richard Petty, the king, is one of them. A 7-time Cup Series champion and one of the most celebrated figures the sport has ever produced, Petty doesn't often wade into the controversies of the modern era without reason, but this incident caught his attention. On the Petty Race Recap podcast, hosted alongside longtime collaborator Dale Inman, Petty addressed the incident directly. When Inman initially described the contact as Wallace sort of getting into the number 77, Petty did not let that framing stand and push back with his own far more direct description of the events. According to Petty, this was not a soft or incidental collision. His take was that Wallace drove hard into Hocevar's car and took it out of the race with purpose and force. That's a significant characterization, because when a seven-time champion with decades of experience watching and competing in short-track racing looks at a replay and concludes it looked intentional, or at minimum deeply reckless, that opinion matters. It doesn't settle the debate, but it shapes it. And the fact that Petty wasn't willing to let a softer description slide tells you something about how the footage looks when you really study it. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because the driver at the center of all of this came forward with his own explanation, and it was a remarkably candid one. After the race, Bubba Wallace sat down for a post-race interview, and whatever you thought of the incident heading into that conversation, what Wallace said made the whole situation more human and more complicated. He acknowledged it. He didn't deflect. He didn't point the finger back at Hocevar and talk about the three-wide move as the thing that started it all, though he did acknowledge it frustrated him. Instead, Wallace took ownership of the moment and said he misjudged it, that he went into the corner thinking he had more room and more control than he actually did, and that the result was not what he intended. He said he was not trying to wreck Hocevar's car. He was trying to make a point through contact, the kind of communication that happens constantly in short-track racing, but that it went wrong. And here's the thing about that kind of honesty. It's rare, not rare in general human life, but rare in professional sports where drivers are coached from a young age to be careful with their words, to protect their image, and to never give critics more ammunition than necessary. Wallace did the opposite. He said essentially that he made a mistake, he misjudged the situation, and it cost them big. Is that explanation fully satisfying to everyone? No. There are fans and analysts who watch the same replay and believe the contact was more intentional than a misjudgment, and Petty's comments suggest at least some people in the sport see it that way. But what Wallace did after the race matters just as much as what happened during it. He stood in front of the camera, he didn't hide, and he called it what he called it. This is the part of the story that goes beyond the controversy and hits at something much more concrete, the championship picture. Bubba Wallace arrived at Martinsville sitting in third place in the NASCAR Cup Series points standings, and that is not a coincidence. That is the result of consistent, quality racing through the early weeks of the season. Speed in practice, clean laps, smart pit strategy, and finishing well when it counted. Third in points is a statement that tells the rest of the garage you're serious this year and puts your name in championship conversations that might otherwise be dominated by the usual suspects. He left Martinsville in 36th place for that race. 36th? And when you fold that result into the overall standings, he dropped from third all the way down into a four-way tie around 8th place. And when the numbers were fully sorted and the tiebreakers were applied, some reports placed him closer to 11th in the actual competitive order. That is a catastrophic single-race swing, not because 11th is shameful, but because of where he was and what that drop means for momentum. Championship contenders can't afford moments like this, because the margin between winning a title and finishing the season as a near-miss story is almost always built up or torn down through moments exactly like this one. You lose that many points in a crash you caused yourself, and suddenly the math that seemed manageable 3 weeks ago is now genuinely complicated. His crew chief, Freddie Kraft, went on the Door Bumper Clear podcast after the race and gave one of the most direct assessments you'll hear from someone inside a team. He said that if Bubba says it was a misjudgment, he'll take him at his word, but he also said clearly, and without softening it, that it was a very costly misjudgment. And then he said something that every driver who wants to compete for a championship needs to hear and internalize. He said, "These moments simply cannot happen at this level. Not occasionally, not once in a while, cannot happen. Because when you're trying to win a championship, every single point is precious, and handing points back to the field through a self-inflicted incident is exactly the kind of thing that turns a potential title run into a footnote." That message didn't come from a rival team or a critic in the media. It came from the man who builds the strategy for Wallace's race team, and when your own crew chief is that direct and that public about it, it tells you exactly where the team stands. Let's step back from the Martinsville drama for a moment and think about the bigger picture for Bubba Wallace in 2025. He has spent years building toward this moment. There was a period early in his career when Wallace was often discussed more for storylines surrounding his background and identity than for his on-track performance. And that's not a knock, it's a reality. He was in underpowered equipment, trying to perform at the highest level, and often driving in circumstances that made standout results difficult. But things changed. 23 Bottas. Oh. Racing grew. The partnership with Michael Jordan and Denny Hamlin gave the team resources and credibility. Toyota's support brought technical depth. And over the past 2 seasons, Wallace started becoming the driver the results showed he was capable of being. This season, the early races suggested he was operating at his highest level yet. And third in points, after several weeks of racing, isn't luck. It's the product of a team and a driver clicking at the right time, making smart decisions, and capitalizing on opportunities. The potential to be a championship-level threat felt real. And now, after Martinsville, there's a fork in the road. Not necessarily a season-ending moment, but a pivotal one. Because how a team and a driver respond to adversity tells you more about their championship character than how they handle easy races with perfect conditions. The question for Wallace isn't just whether he can win races, because he's shown he can compete for wins. The question now is whether he can absorb this, reset his mindset, get his team's confidence back, and come into the next stretch of races with the kind of disciplined and aggressive but clean driving that keeps you in championship contention. Now, let's shift gears entirely and talk about the calendar, because this is something that a lot of casual fans might not fully understand. If you went looking for a NASCAR Cup Series race on the schedule for Easter Sunday, April 5th, 2025, you didn't find one, and for newer fans of the sport, that absence can feel confusing or even frustrating. The answer is simple and rooted in decades of tradition. NASCAR doesn't race the Cup Series on Easter Sunday. This is a long-standing policy that goes back to the very foundations of the sport. Over the entire history of NASCAR's Cup Series, from the late 1940s all the way through the present, the series has only held a race on Easter Sunday on 14 occasions, and most of those instances came during the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s, when the sport was still in its formative years and the calendar was organized very differently than it is today. After that early period, NASCAR made a deliberate decision to keep Easter Sunday off the Cup Series schedule, recognizing that Easter is a significant holiday for a large portion of NASCAR's core fan base, and that racing on that day would conflict with family and religious traditions that matter deeply to many people in the communities that have always supported this sport. The one notable exception in the modern era came in 1989 when a snowstorm forced a Cup race at Richmond International Raceway to be postponed from its original date. The rescheduled event landed on Easter Sunday, not by choice, but by necessity. And that kind of weather-driven postponement is exactly the sort of exception that proves the rule. In more recent years, NASCAR did experiment with the Easter weekend a few times. The Bristol Motor Speedway dirt race was held on Easter weekend in both 2022 and 2023, drawing significant viewership and fan interest. And then in 2024, Richmond hosted a Cup race on Easter weekend. But those experiments didn't become permanent fixtures. And in 2025 and again in 2026, NASCAR has returned to the traditional position of no Cup race on Easter. For longtime fans, this rhythm is familiar. For newer fans, it might feel strange. But there's something almost refreshing about a week where the sport collectively steps back, takes a breath, and gives the audience a moment to absorb everything that's happened. Just because the Cup Series is off doesn't mean NASCAR goes completely quiet this week. The spotlight this Easter weekend shifts to one of the most beloved tracks in the sport's history, Rockingham Speedway, known affectionately as The Rock, a 1.017-mile oval located in Richmond County, North Carolina. It has a storied history in NASCAR, having hosted Cup races from 1965 all the way through 2004 before falling off the schedule, and its return to the NASCAR calendar in recent years has been welcomed enthusiastically by fans who grew up watching the sport there, and by younger fans who have heard stories about what racing at that track was like. The Truck Series races at Rockingham this weekend in the Black's Tire 200, set to go on April 3rd at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time on FS1, and this is the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series, where some of the next generation of Cup Series talent sharpens its skills against veterans who have carved out careers in the division. The racing at Rockingham in the trucks tends to be aggressive and entertaining because the track demands commitment and produces real racing throughout the field. Then, on April 4th, the NASCAR Xfinity Series takes the stage for the North Carolina Education Lottery 250, scheduled for 2:30 p.m. Eastern on the CW network and the Xfinity series is a fascinating mix of established drivers who call that series home, and Cup regulars making occasional appearances with competition levels that are high and racing that is typically close. So, the weekend is not empty. There's legitimate high-quality NASCAR racing happening. It just isn't the Cup Series, and that distinction matters to a lot of fans who specifically follow the top level of the sport. When the Cup Series does come back, it does so at one of the most iconic venues in all of motorsports. Bristol Motor Speedway in Bristol, Tennessee is the kind of track that even non-NASCAR fans have heard of, with a reputation that extends well beyond the traditional fan base. The steep banking, up to 36 degrees in the corners, the half-mile concrete surface, and the incredibly tight racing conditions create a spectacle that is unlike almost anything else in professional racing, and locals call it the world's fastest half-mile for good reason. On April 12th, the Cup Series returns from its Easter break with the Food City 500, scheduled to begin just after 3 p.m. Eastern Time on FS1, and given everything that happened at Martinsville, Bristol could not be a more fitting venue for the comeback race. Short track racing, high emotion, tight corners, and zero room for error. If there's unfinished business between any drivers following the Martinsville incident, and there very well might be, Bristol is exactly the kind of track where that storyline continues. For Bubba Wallace specifically, Bristol becomes a test of character and a chance at redemption. If he comes to Bristol and runs clean, runs fast, and comes away with a strong finish, the Martinsville conversation starts to fade and people focus on the recovery. But if he struggles, or if there's more contact and more controversy, then the story becomes harder to separate from the season. That's the weight a driver carries when they make a costly mistake in a sport where every race immediately becomes history, permanently attached to your record. Before wrapping up, it's worth spending a little time on the philosophical question that moments like Martinsville always raise in NASCAR. Where is the line between hard racing and going too far? This is genuinely not a simple question, because NASCAR has always celebrated physicality and aggression on short tracks. The sport's culture permits and even celebrates a certain level of retaliation and payback as part of the competitive conversation. You bump me, I bump you back harder. You take me out, I remember it the next time we're on a short track together. That unwritten code has been part of racing at places like Martinsville, Bristol, and Richmond for generations, and fans often love it because it creates storylines that extend beyond a single race and gives the sport a personality and a rawness that distinguishes it from more antiseptic forms of motorsports competition. But there's a flip side, and it's the side that matters more and more as NASCAR has grown and as the multi-car nature of these accidents has become more pronounced. When a wreck at Martinsville doesn't just involve the two drivers in a dispute, but instead sweeps in 6, 7, 8 other cars, teams and drivers who had absolutely nothing to do with the tension, then the calculation changes entirely, and it stops being a story about two competitors settling a score and becomes a story about collateral damage. The drivers who got caught up in Wallace and Hochevar's dispute didn't sign up for that. Their crews hadn't done anything wrong. Their race day was derailed by something that had nothing to do with their own decisions or performance. And that's the part of these incidents that never fully gets resolved in the public conversation, because we tend to focus on the two primary parties and forget about everyone else who ends up paying a price. This doesn't mean Wallace is a bad driver or a bad person. It means he made an error in judgment in a high-pressure environment, and the consequences radiated further than he likely intended. And that's the nature of short-track racing at the elite level, where the stakes are high, the margins are thin, and mistakes don't happen in a vacuum. There's an interesting dynamic created by the timing of this Easter break for the Wallace situation, specifically. On one hand, time away from the track is valuable. Race teams that just went through a rough weekend, particularly one with a self-inflicted incident of this scale, can use that time to decompress, to analyze, and to have honest internal conversations about what went wrong and how to prevent it. Engineers can review data. The driver and crew chief can talk openly without the pressure of the next race being just days away. Physical equipment can be evaluated and repaired, and mentally there's an opportunity to reset and come back with fresh perspective. All of that is genuinely useful, and teams that respond well to adversity are often the ones who use the time between bad races wisely, rather than either ignoring what happened or dwelling on it in a destructive way. On the other hand, the break extends the media cycle. In a normal week, a race at Martinsville on Sunday is followed by midweek news, and then a new race the following Sunday that shifts everyone's attention forward. But with a week off, the Martinsville story stays in the spotlight longer. Analysts keep analyzing, fans keep debating, the replays keep circulating, and the commentary from figures like Richard Petty gets more airtime. For Wallace and the 23's SHOCKS team, that means arriving at Bristol with the Martinsville conversation still fresh and still active. Every interview request, every pre-race media session, every social media comment will touch on it, and there's no clean escape into a new narrative until they actually perform at Bristol and give people something new to talk about. In that sense, the break both helps and complicates things. It's an opportunity and a spotlight at the same time. Here's where we land after all of this. Martinsville was a significant event, not because it was necessarily the most dramatic incident in NASCAR history, but because of what it potentially means for the trajectory of a driver who was positioned to have a genuinely landmark season. Bubba Wallace at third in points, running clean and fast through the early schedule, is a story that resonates for a lot of reasons. And now that story has a complication it didn't have 2 weeks ago. Richard Petty's take matters because of who he is and what he's seen. He didn't see this as light or accidental contact, and that framing shaped how many people in the sport received the incident. Freddie Kraft's comments from inside the team matter even more, because they signal that this wasn't brushed off internally and the word costly was used for a reason. Wallace's own honesty, his willingness to stand in front of a camera and say he misjudged it rather than deflecting toward Hochevar's earlier aggression, speaks well of him as a person, even if it doesn't fully settle the debate about intent. Accountability like that is rare and worth acknowledging, even when the underlying act carried real consequences. The Easter break is a reminder that NASCAR respects its traditions, even in an era of constant pressure to maximize broadcast schedules and monetize every available weekend. It's a pause that gives the sport room to breathe, and after a weekend like Martinsville, maybe that's exactly what was needed. And then comes Bristol, the Food City 500, one of the most electric short-track events on the entire calendar. A chance for the championship picture to clarify a little more, for Wallace to either bounce back or continue to struggle, and for all the storylines set in motion at Martinsville to either resolve or intensify. If you're a NASCAR fan, you watch that race knowing all of that context, and that context is what makes the sport so compelling. It isn't just about who crosses the finish line first. It's about everything that led to that moment, the mistakes, the recoveries, the rivalries, and the character that gets revealed under pressure.